people with character or developing the virtues makes you more inclined to make good decisions. Now, it's not a cure-all in and of itself because we're all sinful, right? But the more virtuous you become and the more you develop those virtues, the more your natural inclination is going to be toward living out those virtues in the decisions that you make. So that's a very quick summary of a kind of a complex discussion that we had last week. But I want to close out the discussion with this final C, which is kind of what I think is the biblical model for decision making, ethical decision making. And we're going to use the reason why it's that word in parentheses is because it comes from 1 Corinthians and the King James reading, right? But I had to have a C. I couldn't just put agape or love. I had to have a C to complete the. So, charity. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 14, if somebody could read that. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 14.
Let all that you do be done in love.
All that you do be done in love. Now, there are a lot of people in this world that would agree with that, but would completely misunderstand what is and is not love and loving, right? And so we have to put that or understand that within the context of 1 Corinthians, because that's, and for me, 1 Corinthians fits exactly everything that we've been talking about, because the Corinthians are in a position where there's all kinds of problems, there's all kinds of conflict and strife and division, which you'll remember is one of the things, basically all of the challenges that we talked about to making good decisions, the Corinthians are facing, the Corinthians are dealing with. And so Paul writes to them, and what's interesting is he doesn't just tell them what to do, but if you really read through it and break it down, he gives them an ethic for coming to the conclusions of what he tells them to do. Like he walks them through it. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, chapter 13 and that discussion of love is there. Because again, if you zoom out, you see that he's saying, look, if you would have love as your primary ethic, then you would handle this situation differently, and this situation differently, and this situation differently, and this situation. Everything that he walks through, whether it's their issues with the Lord's Supper, whether it's their divisions and strife that he talks about in the first few chapters, whether it's the decision about whether or not you eat meat offered to idols, all of it is rooted in that ethic of let all that you do be done in love. But again, if you just say that, people don't understand it. So you have to walk through it. So for example, so we're gonna spend time in 1 Corinthians 9 to kind of lay out how decisions are made by Paul. But in 1 Corinthians 5, he has to address, do you remember what issue has to be addressed? Like he says, look, this is sin among you that not even
mother and son.
Yeah, it's a sexual immorality that he says is really not, it's not even common in the Gentile world, right? So he hits it pretty strong. And do you remember what he says needs to happen? He says, put this guy away from you. Now, hardly anybody would identify that as loving, to kick somebody out of church. And that's not exactly, but that's the way people would see that, right? But Paul makes the argument framed in the ethic of love, because he's like, if you love this guy, right? Because he says you'll turn him over for the destruction of the flesh, but the whole idea is you're trying to save his soul. There's no greater love for him than to try to save his soul, right? And destruction of the flesh, what does that mean exactly? I think it has to mean or relates to the idea that the church then was such a family and they were so interdependent upon one another that if he's put out of the family, he might end up in want or in need. But the priority, and see, people would say that's not loving, to let him suffer physically. That's not loving. But Paul makes the argument that it is in this context of agape love and the greatest form of love. So that's just one example of how you can't just pluck this verse out of the context of 1 Corinthians and say, let everything be done in love, without understanding what exactly is love and what does that mean. And my argument is, and we don't have time to do this, but my argument is that if you walk through the whole book of 1 Corinthians and throw 2 Corinthians in there too, you can come away with the application of love as an ethic to decision making if you break down all of the decisions that he makes and tells them how to make. Any thoughts on that? T, that was a big...
That was almost a Gary.
It was. Okay, so let's go to 1 Corinthians 9. And because he really, really walks through a decision here that he made. And he's having to defend against seems to be some allegations that are made about him, maybe about his apostleship. We do know he has to come back around to defending that more in 2 Corinthians. So he's obviously having to defend his ministry, right? So he starts out by saying, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you. Like, he's using them as the evidence of his apostleship. Like, the church here exists because I'm an apostle and was sent to the Gentiles. Like, you should know this. But he says, this is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? We'll kind of, I won't read all of these details, but he says, let's see. Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? So he goes through. Look, me and Barnabas, we have the right to these different things, and we have just as much right as any of the other apostles or anybody else doing this missionary work does. And if you skip down to verse 12, about the middle of the verse, he says, nevertheless, we've not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temples are... And he goes back to another justification for the right to be paid for the ministry, the right to partake in the physical, if he's imparting to them the spiritual, right? And he makes a couple of arguments on why that is a right or why that's justified. But then in verse 15, he says, I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. I have not used this right, and I'm not asking for it now. I'm not telling you this because I want to use it now. But he says, I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. And that's not an arrogant boasting. If you see what he says, for I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. Why? For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. And so God called me to preach the gospel. It's a necessity that I preach the gospel. So I can't be, there's no boast, or there's no even pride in the good sense of it, because he's just like, this is what God told me to do. This is what I have to do. It's not like I have contributed anything to it, or I have volunteered it in any way, or like, this is what I have to do. He says, for if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I'm still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. He says, this is what I can do, right? This is what I can contribute. I don't have any choice over the fact that I've got to preach the gospel. That's a stewardship that God has put on me. I'm accountable for that. I have the right to be supported by you in doing it, but that's where I'm going to make a contribution myself by not imposing that right upon you, by choosing not to exercise that right. And that's not something that's imposed upon me. That's not something I have to do, but I'm making the choice because that's my contribution, my willing contribution to this. Right? Does that make sense? And then he says, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. And then the famous discussion of right, to the Jews became I as a Jew, to the Greeks became all of that. Why? Well, verse 23, I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. So this is what Paul says, this is what I've decided to do. Here's what I could have done, but here's my rationale, or here's my thought process for the decision that I made. And it is rooted in the ethic of charity. Paul's love for them, Paul's love for God, it's Paul being able to sacrifice, which is what agape is, the giving of oneself, right? Now, let's kind of hang on that for just a minute and we'll come back to it. But when we talk about decision making, how many of us use a formal decision making process? A set of questions, or so there's a number of different formal processes. There's like a Foursquare process, right? Where you're like, okay, write the problem here, and then write. There's a number of different kind of questions that you can find. I mean, they teach them in business school. There's all kinds of different processes. There's one called the moral brief, which is written, it's kind of like a legal brief kind of thing, where you're really breaking down a problem. I don't know if anybody uses it, because by the time you write all of that stuff down, the problem is probably already gone. No decision to make. But I like, and this is what has helped, what it's worked for us at work. We didn't even know we were using it. And if you ask anybody that works with me, they will not be able to tell you that we use the 5 timeless questions model. But when I read about the 5 timeless questions model, I go, oh, this is what we've been doing. And so I'm not saying that this is your model, but I'm saying this is helpful to me, because remember, what we talked about with decisions is we understand there's right and wrong. And we understand that God's word is the foundation of right and wrong. That's not where we're struggling with making decisions. Where we're struggling with making decisions is in the gray areas, just like Paul makes a decision right here. He could have done this and he could have done this, and either one of them was right, technically. But what was the best decision in that circumstance, given the complexity? And so the reason why I like the 5 timeless questions is because it is designed for making a decision in the gray. In the gray. So I want to show you how this works in light of 1 Corinthians 9. And this is not where I had intended to go, because I printed out everybody a handout of different questions that come directly from 1 Corinthians. But you can take that and you can look at that on your own. That's straight from 1 Corinthians, got the verse by it. But I just wanted to show you, I thought it would be helpful to break down this particular decision. And that's one way for us to do that. All right. So the first question of the 5 timeless questions is, what are the net consequences? What do you think is meant by net consequences? So it's not just the consequences, which, remember, we talked about when we talked about complexity. We have to be able to look past just the immediate consequence, because there are unintended consequences as well. Or you take medication and there's side effects, right? So
long-term consequences.
yeah. So the net consequences is just a way of saying, don't just very quickly go, oh, if we do this, this will happen. Stop and break it down and think deeply about what the consequences are. Stop and look for more information. Use a good process. Consult others, right? Get different perspectives. Get the right people with the right expertise involved. Do you think, when you look at 1 Corinthians 9, that Paul is looking at net consequences? Does it look like he's done a little deeper thinking about this rather than just a gut immediate reaction?
Yes.
It sounds to me, when you read it, that there's a little bit of turmoil that he's gone through to make the decision. I think he's confident in it, and I think he's happy with it, and he's defending it, but it's not a gut reaction decision. So what are some of the consequences that you think he might have considered in thinking about the net consequences?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago with kicking the guy out for sleeping with his mother. It's not just a benefit for the congregation, but it can be a benefit to him as well. And thinking past the immediate, yeah, he's obviously going to be mad that he's pushed away, but sometimes that's what it needs. And so looking forward and realizing that the betterment for him and definitely for everybody else is to push him out of the way.
Yeah. You know, there's a multitude of people involved, right, that are already converted, but there's division. There is the context of Corinth and the desire for other people to be influenced and saved as well. And so, and there's Paul and Barnabas, yes, but it's like, okay, if we do this, here's the benefit to us, but that doesn't necessarily benefit them. And so what benefits them? But okay, what also benefits, or what would be the consequence in Corinth itself and the surrounding? And so a lot of things that we don't always kind of know as we read this is, is, there were philosophers and stuff in Corinth that preached for profit. This was the kind of setting where he could, if he's already having to defend his apostleship to the Christians, right? Is this something that's going to add legitimacy to him or take away from it? And so it's a deeper look at it, right? Just like you pointed out. What's interesting is you can compare it to him later taking or accepting support from Philippi. But it's a different context. He's in jail, he's in prison when he accepts support from, or under house arrest when he accepts support from Philippi. And the context of talking about Philippi isn't controversy and issues, it's joint participation and it's them being a part of the work, not him having to kind of confront them. So it's a different context, so it's a different decision. That in and of itself is probably a very important lesson for us in the church to think about, because we like to get in these real rigid patterns of here's how we do mission work, or here's how we do this or that. And I believe in patterns, but there are some things that maybe should be a little more flexible depending upon the situation and the circumstance, right? All right, so the second one then is, what are my core obligations? What are my core obligations? Does Paul highlight his core obligations in 1 Corinthians 9?
Yes. Preach the gospel.
His highest priority is proclamation of the gospel, because that's the stewardship that God's imposed upon him, right? What other obligations does he emphasize?
His obligation to the church at Corinth.
His obligation to them. In other settings from chapter 9, their obligations to God, to that man, to the church itself, because I didn't mention this earlier, but he also makes the argument a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And so part of putting them out is loving the church that you have to protect from the sinful influence, right? So the ethic of charity is there in all of it. But yeah, he really, really comes back to that core obligation. And what's interesting is, if you pull out that core obligation or you lessen that core obligation, you very likely come up with a different decision, different conclusion. But he highlights that core obligation, and it's at the center of his whole argument. My observation is that a lot of people, when they make decisions, don't ask, what's my core obligation? They ask, what are my rights? Right? What can I do? Rather than, what is a core obligation that should guide all of my decisions?
Responsibilities cast aside.
Because that's getting that responsibility in it. All right, number 3 is, because we're running out of time, what will work in the world as it is? What will work in the world as it is? Why would that be important to ask it that way? It's not just about what will work in the world as it is. Because when I'm doing this exercise cognitively, I can come up with the ideal solution, the ideal end result. But I can't always make that happen because there's other things involved. So like at work, we're navigating the requirements of the state, we're navigating court system, we're navigating parents of kids that don't want to comply with requirements to get their kids back. We're navigating. There's a whole lot of the system that's coming together, and There's only so much that we can do. And so we have an ideal solution, but we can't implement it. And so what can we do in the world as it currently is? That's really frustrating. But you got to be able to do something. And maybe the only thing you can do is something in the world as it is, not as you would like it to be. And so that's where the culture and context of Corinth comes in, right? City full of professional orators, status-seeking people. Financial support could come with strings attached, social baggage. I understand that. And so he's got to operate in the context of Corinth. Number 4, who are we? Who are we? And that's a question that looks at identity and shared values. You really see, this is what I love about 1 Corinthians and really all of Paul's writing. He wears his identity on his sleeve. He's walking you through what he thinks about and what he struggles with and how he, right? And so this is about his identity, not as a professional, but as a servant. And so that's put out there. We do that a lot at work. Who are we? Well, we're not just like any other agency that does foster care or whatever. Like, we're Christians that are doing this. And so our decisions can't just be modeled after what everybody else does, because who are we? Who are we? And then finally, the last question is, what can I live with? He uses that word boasting, which again isn't about an arrogance or a pride, but it's kind of the reward that he can carry, because he's got this attitude that, like, the preaching of the gospel is my obligation. I have to do that. And so it's like that statement in Luke where it's like, we've done what you've asked us to do. We're unprofitable servants. Like, we didn't really do anything or contribute anything. We just did what we were told. And so what he can live with in this circumstance is not charging them, right? His conscience is clear on it. It's not something that he's going to struggle with later. And so he can live with this decision. So his reward, he talks about that reward. So his reward isn't salary. His reward is freedom and integrity of his ministry in that context. He concludes that he can live with physical hardship, manual labor. He was making tents to survive while he did that. But what he can't live with is knowing that he hindered the gospel. And that's what he thinks happens unless he makes this decision. And so I think this is a good model. I think you see it in Paul. And I would venture to say that you could use those same questions as you move through Corinthians into some different decisions that are made. And you could see that play out. But he outlines this question in the book. The book answers this question. It's about the ethic of love. The core obligation is charity. But again, make sure you define what that is, because we've watched some videos on Sunday mornings that would be all over that, but they're not defining it the same way. So if you want it, here are some questions from 1st and 2nd Corinthians that you can take that are kind of a Corinthian model. But I appreciate the opportunity to teach the class and walk through this, and I enjoyed it, and I hope you got something out of it. So where's Alan?
His back's bothering him.